Hi and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to have a look at the Spotify iOS SDK, which is still in a beta phase, but nevertheless we're going to have a look at the functions that we can use and how to integrate that into our own apps and how the user authentication process works so that you can integrate this SDK with your apps and play around with it and explore great ideas that become possible with this Spotify SDK. So as you can see here, we have a little demo application where only a Spotify login button is displayed. You can get this login button from the developer page of Spotify, and I'm going to show you what happens when I click on this button. So let me click on it, and as you can see, we're moving to a Safari window where we can connect our Tutorial 1 app to your Spotify account. The important thing is for you to play music and to stream audio using the Spotify SDK, you need a Spotify Premium account, which is free for 30 days. So if you want to play around with it, get this 30-day free period. And if you have already a Spotify Premium account, you can of course use that. So let me click on login and enter my credentials. And once I press the login button, as you can see, we come back to the app and playing some music. And of course you can also, let me quit that. Of course you can also see some background image where the actual album art is displayed. So this is what we are going to create, and now let me show you what kind of stuff we need in order for this to work. Let's first of all open Safari and let's search for the Spotify SDK, so Spotify iOS SDK. And there we go, and please note that here it says it is important that the iOS SDK is currently a beta release. The content and functionality of future versions is likely to change significantly and without warning. So keep this in mind and always have a look at this Spotify page here, and you're good to go, and you have to implement the changes, of course, but I think it's worth having a look nevertheless. So what we want to do first is actually download the SDK. As you can see here, here's the download button, and we can download the latest iOS SDK version, which is beta 6. And we can get this from GitHub. So let's go ahead and download the source zip file, and let's go back. And what you also need to do is create a developer account for creating an API key or secret and a client ID. And to do that, what we want to do is clicking on this tutorial and examples, and we provide a beginner's tutorial, which you can find here, and also here is the beginner tutorials button. And we want to scroll down here to creating your client ID secret and callback URI, which is a very important part, and I'm going to explain that in a second. So let's click on My Applications. I'm going to open that in a new tab, since we need both sides in a moment. And as you can see, I already created a developer account, which has this Tutorial 1 app. So what you want to do is click on Create an App and enter an application name, an application description, and click Create after you have created this developer account, which is not necessarily a premium account, so you can do that for free. And now, once you have created your app, let's click on it. And you could also enter a website, but the most important thing actually is here at the bottom, which is the client ID, the client secret, and this redirect URI. And as you can see, this looks like an ordinary URL, except for the protocol here at the front, which is Spotify tutorial. So if you add an URI, so you click on add URI, and then you could say something like your app name : // So this is actually the protocol that you're going to use, and that we need to listen to within our iOS app, so that we know once we come back from the Spotify login page, as you have seen earlier, we're going to open a Safari window where the Spotify login is displayed, and once you click on login, you will be routed back to your application, and the application needs this URI to receive the additional information like the session that Spotify is going to give you. So we're going to call that return after login to identify the process that is going to happen. So you click add, and don't forget to save this. And once you've done that, we can go back to the Spotify tutorial and scroll down a little more, and as you can see here, we have to set up a token exchange service. And to do that, we are going to install some Ruby stuff and some server stuff, because this token exchange service is nothing more than a small HTTP service called a token exchange service. And so that we can use it, you have to copy this command, sudo gem install Sinatra encrypted strings. So copy that and open your terminal. And once you've opened your terminal, you can simply paste that command to your terminal, hit enter, and enter your password, and that's it. So I have already installed that, so I don't have to do that. But what we also need is a little piece of software, so which we can get here, in order to deploy this Heroku stuff. We click on the example, come to a GitHub page where we can download the Spotify token swap service .rb, a Ruby file, and we'll simply download that as well and configure that in a second. So let's move both the Spotify token swap master folder that we've downloaded and the iOS SDK beta to our desktop. And now let's extract from this Spotify token swap master this Ruby file and also drag that to the desktop, and then we can actually delete the rest of that stuff. So let's just get rid of that. And here is our Spotify token swap file, which we are going to open. And as you can see, let me just bring that to the side. And as you can see here, there's some placeholders. We can also delete all these comments here, which tell us how to activate the service, connecting to localhost :1234, which is the port swap. So let's just delete that to give us some more space here. And now what we are interested in actually is, first of all, uncomment this line so that we set this port to 1234, and also we're interested in these three lines: client ID, client secret, and callback URI. And as you might have already guessed, we're going to get this stuff, let's close this GitHub page, from the Spotify developer page, and there is our client ID and client secret. So let me just copy the client ID and paste it here to client ID, and let me copy the client secret and also paste that here, and also copy the redirect URI and paste that here. So this is all, and let's save that file, and this is actually all the preparation we need for this Spotify token swap file. So we can close that now, but what we need to do is open up a terminal again. And what we want to do here is now run this file. So we will type in cd to change the directory and go to our desktop where it is located. And now we simply write Ruby Spotify token swap and hit enter. And now the service is running. And now we can actually go to our Safari and type in localhost 1234. And as you can see, the Sinatra server is running. So let's close that. Let's also close this this tutorial here. And is there something else? I don't think so. So now we can also close Safari and prepare our Xcode project. So let me move this to the side. And now let's create a new Xcode project, which is going to be a single view application. So hit next. This is going to be, let's say, Spotify demo. We won't use core data. This can be a universal app. So click next and create that on the desktop. And first of all, what we need to do is have a look at the iOS SDK 6 folder, and there is our Spotify framework, which we are going to use. So let's move that to our project, and don't forget to select copy items if needed, so this is a part of our project, and finish this. And now we can close that. And now let me just resize my window here, and let's zoom in a little to the bottom. And as you can see here, we have linked frameworks and libraries. Spotify framework is already a part of it. And what we also need is going to be the AV foundation framework. So let's select that and add that as well. And as you can see here, now we have the AV Foundation as a linked framework. And as you remember, we also talked about these callback URIs, and we have created this callback URI in the Spotify developer section. And to make the corresponding changes in our project, we'll have a look at our info tab here at the top of our Xcode window and have a look at the URL types. And what we want to do here is pretty simple. We want to add another URL type. So let's give this an identifier, something like com.training.spotify authentication, something like that. And the URL scheme is the Spotify tutorial. And this is pretty important. So let me hit enter here. Everything we enter here is going to be placed into the info plist of your project. So this URL scheme is actually the same as we have as a callback URL here. And as you can see, this is everything from the start to the colon. And this is really important that they are exactly the same. So the URL scheme needs to be exactly the same as the callback URI protocol name, everything before the colon. All right, so this is one modification. Next modification is going to take place in the build settings, and here are some huge stuff. So we don't even need basic; we need everything, and we're going to use the search here and look for other linker flags. And what we are going to need is the linker flag Objective-C. So let's add dash Objective-C. So this is one linker flag that we need to set in order for the Spotify framework to work properly. And now we can move on to import the Spotify framework. And since this framework is written in Objective-C, what we need to do is create a bridging header. So let's just select the viewcontroller.swift file, create a type Command N on your keyboard, and let's create a new Cocoa Touch class. It can be a view controller, whatever actually, but make sure you select Objective-C, click Next, and create. And now Xcode is going to ask us if we want to create an Objective-C bridging header. We say yes, and there we go. There's our Spotify demo bridging header, and now we can actually delete those two Objective-C classes or class files that we have just created, the header file and the implementation file, and simply delete them, move them to trash. And now we can work with our Spotify framework and import that here. So let me zoom in a little. And what we want to do is we want to import Spotify/Spotify.h. And actually that's it. Now we have all the preparations ready, and we can use our project to work together with Spotify, and we can now think about the user interface, which is actually pretty simple. But let me show you where you can get this Spotify button. So let's open Spotify developer, and there is where is it? Design resources here in the left bar. And now we can download the design resources as a zip file. And let's open our images assets folder here in the left, on the left side of our Xcode project. Scroll down here and add another image set. We're going to call this image set, let's say, a login button. And for simplicity's sake, here are the Spotify buttons, and here let's say login with Spotify PNG, and there is this mobile file. So let's just enter that for all three sizes. You could actually adapt them to the correct screen size, but I will simply use this size now for all of them. Go to our main storyboard and let's add a button. So here is a button. And what we want to do with this button actually is, first of all, remove the text and then change the image to the login button, and there we go. Let's place that in the center. And now we're going to use some auto layout constraints to make sure it is always positioned in the center on every device. So press the Control key on your keyboard and drag from the button to the view and select center horizontally in container and center vertically with the shift key pressed, and then you can simply press enter, and as you can see there are auto layout constraints. And now we'll bring up the assistant editor, and first of all we will create an outlet for this button, which is the login button, and also we'll create an action. So again, control drag, and we'll say this is going to be an action, and say login with Spotify. All right, so this is going to be the first thing we want to do. We want to log in with Spotify. So let's close the assistant editor, enter our view controller, and zoom into our login method, login with Spotify. And if you remember the demo I showed to you earlier about logging in with Spotify, you saw that we have entered Safari. So what we need to do actually is create a URL that will open a Safari window. And to do that, we will first of all create an authentication object and use the SPT authentication class and its default instance. And now we can create a login URL. And using this authentication object and say login URL for client ID, declared redirect URL, and scopes. And now you can see that there must be some kind of client ID, and we need a declared redirect URL. And therefore we're going to create some constants here at the top of our view controller class. And let me first create these constants with a leading K for constant, which is first of all the client ID, and this is going to be an empty string for now, and then we are going to need the callback URL. We will also need the token swap URL for the token exchange service, and also we're going to need a refresh service, so ktoken refresh service URL, which we're going to use since the sessions that we're going to create are about to expire from time to time, and we need to refresh them. And to enter the client ID, I will simply use our Ruby file that we have here, the Spotify token, and copy the client ID and zoom in again. As for the callback URL, you know, we have created this callback URL at the Spotify Developer Center. So let's enter the Spotify tutorial //return after login. I actually could also copy that from the from this file so that I don't make any typing mistakes. So this is that. And now let's move on to the swap URL. And the swap URL is actually our server that we set up using the Ruby file. So this is going to be http://localhost. The port was 1234. And for the swap service, we're going to use /swap. And for the refresh, http://localhost port 1234. And here we are going to use refresh. This is all part of this file that we have customized earlier, where we entered our client ID, client secret, and callback URL. And now that we have all of this information, we can move on to our login button again and can enter here our client ID, which is simply the client ID. The declared redirect URL is we have to create a URL from that string. So this is going to be the K callback URL, and the scope of our for this login URL is going to be, as you can see, it needs to be an array. So let's make some brackets here. It's going to be SPT authentication streaming, the authentication streaming scope, and that's it. Actually, there is our that is going to create our login URL, and now we can simply use UI application, shared application, and now open a URL, and this is of course our login URL. And now we can run this application for the first time, and as you can see, there is our Spotify button, and once I click on the login with Spotify, we will be redirected to the Spotify website here, and we can connect our Tutorial 1 application to our Spotify account. Once we click on login, we can enter our credentials. But if we were to click on login, nothing would happen yet, even if I would enter the correct credentials, since Spotify is going to try to call back our app and give it some more information. And to receive this information, we have to go back to our app delegate. Since in the app delegate, we can use a delegate method that can listen for URLs that are used by Spotify and other services when calling back our app. So first of all, let's copy these constants here and also paste them here into our app delegate, Swift file. And let's now add this delegate method, which is called application did open with open URL, source application, and annotation. And the first thing we need to do here is check if the URL that we are receiving is a Spotify authentication callback. So we'll use an if statement, again use the SPT authentication class and its default instance, and now we'll ask if this if we can handle this URL, which is this URL here, with declared redirect URL, which is our callback URL. So again, we have to create a URL from our string, so NSURL parentheses string, and this is the k callback URL. And now, if that is the case, so if we can handle this, if we can handle the URL that we are receiving, we also know that we have received an authentication callback that we can now handle. And with this authentication callback, we can create a logged-in session. So let's again use the SPT authentication class, the default instance, and this time let's use the handle authentication callback with triggered authentication URL. And again, we are going to use this URL we are getting from our delegate method. So this is URL. And now it asks for the token swap service endpoint at URL. And this is actually the token swap service URL that we have predefined here. So again, let's say ns URL from a string URL with a string k token swap URL. And now we'll simply add this callback. So it requires us to enter an error, so ns error. And here is the interesting part, which is the session object, which we can use later to identify our app as an authenticated app that is allowed to play music, that is allowed to use the Spotify premium services. So again, here session is going to be an SPT session object. Let me zoom out. Session SPT object. All right. And now let me just enter return false here to get rid of this error. And what we want to do here now is actually first of all check if there was an error. Since we have an error object here, we can also use it and check if there was an error. So if error not equal to nil, so there is an error in this case, we can print line authentication error and type in return so that the function breaks off and does not continue with running the code that is below that return. And now that we have this session, we should do something with it. And we can actually use the session and save it somewhere. And where is the best place to save it, and what is the easiest way to save this? Actually, we can use NSUser defaults for that. And let me just give you a little introduction to NSUser defaults, which are quite handy. To use NSUser defaults, we have to create a user defaults object, so user defaults. And we use NSUser defaults, standard user defaults. And this is used for little amounts of data that have a key and a value, actually much like a dictionary. But what we can do here is we can say set bool for key, for example. Let's set this to true. And let's say premium purchased, whatever. And we now have sent, what we need to do is actually synchronize this. This is actually something like save. And what this does is it saves in this user defaults section of your app. It saves a value and a key for premium purchased in this case, and you could use that to save some little information when you have in-app purchases in your app and someone has purchased something. Then you can set this bool to true, and you can then use something like that if user defaults bool for key premium purchased, then some kind of function display premium stuff, something like that. But I think you get the idea. And the only problem with user defaults is that you have to that you're pretty confined to the types of values that you can set. As you can see, you can set a bool, double float, integer, an object, an URL, maybe also no string. But as you can see, you can set an object. But you can set a session object into this user defaults. This just won't work. But we can set an object to using these user defaults, but we have to take a little side way to get this done. And what we need to do to make this happen is we will keep this user defaults here, but we will convert our session object into a data object. So let's say we have session data, and now we can use a so-called NSKeyed archiver and use it to archive data with root object. And our root object is actually our session object. And this gives us a data object. And now we can simply use our user defaults and set an object for a key, and we will simply use the session data for the key Spotify session, and then synchronize that, and then this is done. And we have saved our session and can now work with the session to listen to music, for example. So now that we have completed this authentication process, we can go back to our view controller and make this somehow visible to our users that the login was quite successful. And let's therefore add a notification in view.load. So that we can fire this notification once the login process in app delegate is completed. So let's use the NS notification center and the default center and add an observer for our view controller. So let's enter self, and the selector that we want to call the function, let's call that update after first login, and the name is going to be let's say login successful. And we don't need an object here. And now let's implement this function. So let's say directly under the view.load. We don't need the notification object, so this is an empty function here. And what we want to do actually is hide the login button as soon as the login is successful. So let's say login button dot hidden equals true. And let's say if we launch the app by standard, let's say that the login button is also hidden. And only if we don't have a session, let's show this login button. So therefore, we will again use the user defaults. So let's create a user defaults object, which is NS user defaults, standard user defaults. And now we can check if the user defaults, well, let's do it a little different. Let's create a session object directly. So if we have a session object, which we have to explicitly type as an any object, and we can set our user defaults object for key Spotify session to it. then we obviously have already a session. So let's make a comment here, session available. And if this is not the case, then we haven't logged in yet, and then we can display our button. So login button hidden equals false. And now we can just have a look at that and give it a go. So there's our login button. So obviously we don't have a session yet. So I press login. I get to the Spotify website. I press login, enter my user credentials, and after I press login, we will be rerouted back to our application. I have to allow that. And as you can see, nothing happens yet since we did not fire the notification. So let me just do that and copy this notification name, which is login successful, and we want to do that in the app delegate after we have saved our session here. So let's say NS notification center, default center, post notification with a name. And this is the name, and we don't need an object here. But if I run the app again now, you can see that the login button is no longer present. But let me reset contents and settings here of our simulator and run the app again, so that I can log in again and log into Spotify, my credentials, and there we go. As you can see, there is no button there anymore. Next up, we have to think about the refreshing process, because as I've told you, from time to time your session expires and we have to refresh it. So let's go back to the view controller, since view did load is a pretty good place to check it. So every time you launch your app again, we check if the session is still valid. And if the session is available, what we need to do is first of all convert this session object back to a SPT session object, since this is at the moment an any object, a data object actually. So let's first of all create a session data object constant and convert the session object to an NS data object. And now we can create a real session object, say session equals, and now we will use the NS-keyed unarchiver and call unarchive object with data and use the session data object for that. And now that we have a session object again, we can use a pretty, let's also cast it to SPT session object. And now that we have this session object, we can now check if the session is valid. So, and if it is not valid, so let's add an exclamation mark here at the front. If it's not valid, we want to refresh it or renew it, as Spotify calls it. So let's use the SPT authentication object again and the default instance. And now let's call renew session with service endpoint and a callback URL, and the session is the session that we just received with the service endpoint, and this is actually again a URL, so NS URL with a string, and we will then use the K token, the string K token refresh service URL, and we have a callback here. So let's again use that. There's an error, NS error, and also there is the session. So this is going to be the SPT session object. And now that we have that, we can again check if there was an error or if there was no error. So if error equals nil, we can continue. And now let's add this renewed session to our user default, so that we can use it throughout the app. If you would have different view controllers, this could become really handy. So let's use user defaults set object. Or first of all, we would need to create a session data object again. So let's say session data, and again use the NS-keyed archiver and archive data with root object, and this would be the session itself. And now we can use our user defaults set object session data for key Spotify session. And let's don't forget to synchronize here, user defaults synchronize. And let's also create a session object here as a property. So var session, it's going to be spt session. And here we go, this is our session. And now we can say self.session equals session. And we also want to call a play function here, play using session. We're going to create this function in a second. And let's say if there was an error, let's say else, and print line error refreshing session. And if there was no if the session is valid, we have to go to this if statement, say else, let's print line session valid, and also call the play using session function here. And actually that's it. Now let's go to the play using session function that we're going to write. And this is actually the fun part, since we now are about to play our first piece of music. So let's say play using session, and there is a session object, let's say, and this is going to be spt session, which is no optional value. And now in order to play music, what we need is a player. So let's scroll up, and beneath the session, let's also create a player, which is an SPT audio streaming controller, which we will declare as an optional. And once we return back to our play using session function, we will first of all check if our player is nil. So if it is, we want to create it, so player equals spt streaming controller, and we want to initialize it with a client ID, which is our constant client ID. So now we have created a player, and what we want to do now is actually log in using our session. So let's say player login with session and a callback. So there is, and we will use our session object and a callback, and here we go, and there's only an error, ns error. And if the error is not equal to nil, we can say print line enabling playback got error. In this case, it makes sense to see what the error actually is and print this, and also return here so that the function does not continue. And the first thing now we want to do is play a demo album, which is also stated in the tutorial that was prepared from Spotify. And now we'll use a so-called SPT request and request an item at URI. And this URI is actually, again, a URL, and we will now say ns URL with a string, and there is a special format about the Spotify URI. So what we do is Spotify :album. And I'm going to copy now the album identifier. So let me go back to Safari, and let's go to the iOS SDK and the beginner's tutorial, and let's scroll down. And there should be somewhere, and there it is. There is the Spotify album with its with the identifier. So let's paste that here, and this will play a whole album for us. So let's say with session, and we've got our session object here, and we again have a callback here. So let's use it, and there is an error, ns error, and an any object, and this object will give us the album itself. So let's use this again as an any object, and we will cast that now to an album in a second after we have checked for the error. If error not equal to nil, what we want to do is again print line album look up got error, and again the error here, and return, and that's it. And now we can cast this any object that we have here, which is now a real album object, and let's do it the other way around. Let's say album object here, and this is going to be an album. And now let's say album object as spt album. And now we can use our player and say player self. Since we're in a closure, we have to use self.player, and now we say play track provider, and the track provider is our album. And now the callback is going to be nil. And then let's go back up to our view.load method and also play the session. And actually, it makes a lot of sense changing the name here. Since we have multiple session objects here, let's call this one renewed session. And let's set self.session to this renewed session. And now let's say self.play using session with this renewed session. And here again, we can simply use this this session object since it is valid. So let's enter session here. And that's it actually. Now let's give it a try and run the app. And as you can see, session is valid. And there's our music. And this is actually the demo album. And now let's also handle this update after first login, since this is a very important part, so that also the music plays when you enter your user data for the first time and use the app for the first time. So what we want to do here is again create a user defaults object, user defaults, which is NS user defaults, standard user defaults, and if there is a session object that we can use, which is going to be an any object, let's say user defaults object for key. This is Spotify session. And now, if this is the case, if we have a session object, we can create this session object, or a session data object is going to be session object as NSData. And now we use the NSKeyed unarchiver. So let's say first time session is going to be NSKeyed unarchiver, unarchive object with session data object, and now cast that to an SPT session. And now all we need to do is play using session first time session. And now it also works when we have created, when we have just launched the app for the first time and entered our user credentials for the first time, and so on. So now what we also want to do is actually displaying some album art, and also what we want to do is playing this as soon as the playback begins. And to check if the playback begins, what we have to do is adopt a protocol. So let's scroll up to the top and use the SPT audio streaming playback delegate. And now we'll scroll down a little and add a delegate method here at the bottom, which is audio streaming did let me do that again. Audio streaming did start playing track. And what we want to do here is update cover art. And in order for this to work, for this audio streaming did start playing track method to be called, we also need to set the delegate to our player once it's initialized. So let's say player.playback delegate equals self. And now let's create this update cover art function. Let's say here, just beneath the login with Spotify, let's say update cover art. And this is actually pretty simple stuff, but before we can do that and before we can update cover art, let's adjust our user interface a little. And to show this cover art, we'll simply use an image view, drag that to here, and make its size 600 by 600, 600, 600, and now we can simply drag that to the top left corner, and let's place it beneath the button. And now we can add our layout constraints again, which is pretty simple. Press Shift on your keyboard, leading space, trailing space, top space, bottom space, and this should do it. This will make this image view exactly the same size as the view itself. And what we also want to do is adjust the image mode so that it is scale of aspect fill. And now we will simply add an outlet for this artwork image view. So let's add an outlet here with the assistant editor, artwork image view. And now we can go back to our function to implement this update artwork. And what we want to do here is check if our player and its current track metadata is equal to nil. Because if it's the case, and this is nil, we want to display an empty image. So let's say artwork image view.image equals an empty UI image. All right, and we can return and do nothing else. And since we need a session now, let's also make some adjustments to our viewDidLoad method again. First of all, if our session is still valid, we can use self.session equals session, since this one is going to work, and it is valid, we can use that. And also here, for our first time session, let's also say self.session equals first time session, so that we can use that. And now let's go back to our update cover art function. And what we want to do now is actually creating a URI that will ask for a specific cover and for the album cover, and we will use our player and access its current track metadata. And this is actually a dictionary, so we can use a key that is called SPT audio streaming metadata album URI as string. And now we can use the SPT album and say album with URI. And now we can enter an NS URL with a string, which is the URI, and a session, which is simply session, and a callback where we have an error, NS error, and an album object, which is defined as any object here. So let's first cast this album object to a real album, so album object as SPT album. And now we can say if let image URL equals album.largest cover.image URL as NS URL, and also unwrap that. So if this works and we get an image URL, what we want to do is, first of all, dispatch this asynchronously so that we download the album image in the background. So let's say dispatch asynchronously with a dispatch get global queue with identifier, which is going to be dispatch queue the priority default, which is this one, and a flag of 0, and there is our dispatch block. And now we want to create an error object, which is an NS error, which needs to be optional, and we set it to nil. And we also want to create an UI image object, so cover image equals UI image, And now we can say if let image data equals ns data contents of URL. And there we are going to use the image emg URL. The options are going to be nil, but our error object is going to be entered here so that we can check if there was an error. But we don't have to, of course. So if error equals nil, so if there was no error, let's bring that in there. If there was no error, what we want to do is say cover image equals UI image with data image data. And add an exclamation mark here so that it is unwrapped. This should make the error go away. And now after we have done this background stuff, we can return back to the main queue. So let's say dispatch asynchronously, and this time on the main queue, dispatch get main queue with a block. And what we want to do here is simply say self.artwork image view.image equals cover image. And that's it. So now let's run the application again. Session is valid, and as you can see, nothing happens. Our music plays, but we already have defined the did start playing track delegate method, but what we have to do, of course, is update the cover art as soon as this track starts playing. So let's do it again. And there it is. There's our cover art that represents the album that is playing at the moment. Now, since this is the easiest way I could show you how to play music, I want to show you now how you can play custom music. Since here we are playing a demo album, and you need a album identifier here, I'm going to show you now how you can search for some custom pieces of music. So let's comment this piece out and do another SPT request where we can enter a custom title for a specific song that you want to listen to. So what we want to do is again create an SPT request, and this time we want to perform a search with query, query type, offset, and so on. So let's just use that. And the search query, let me say, is going to be Let It Go. Which will play this famous Disney song. The query type is going to be an SPT search query type of type query type track. We don't need an offset, so let's say 0. We don't need a session for that, so let's give that nil. And now we have here an error as in the callback, and the any object is actually the results that we get from the from this query. So let's say any object here, any object. And what we need to do now is working with this result. So this result object that we get here is actually a so-called SPT list page. So let's create a track list page and convert the result as SPT list page. And now what we need to do is get a so-called partial track. So let's say partial track equals track list page dot items. So this gives us all the items that we receive from the from this query. For simplicity's sake, I'm simply use the first object here and hope that it will play the song that I'm looking for, but you would have to analyze that in a productive environment so that you can check if this is really the search song that you queried for. So I'm going to convert that to an SPT partial track. And now I can request an item saying SPT request item from partial object, and the partial object is this partial track that I have generated here, and we won't need a session here either, and we have a callback here again with an error and as error, and in this case the result is going to be a track. So let's again call this result any object. And now we won't check for errors here. You should, but again, for simplicity's sake, you have seen how to check for errors now in many cases. So let's simply play that track now. So let's say this is going to be a track. We use the results, convert it to an SPT track. And now we can again use our player. So let's say self.player.play track provider. And this time our track provider is not an album, but a single track. And we won't have a callback here. So that's it actually. And with this, we hopefully will listen to some Disney music now. So let's give it a try. And there we go, there is Frozen. And I'm going to quit that, not that the that this video is going to be deleted from YouTube because of some kinds of rights problems by playing Disney music. So that's it actually. You have now created an application that takes advantage of the Spotify API. You have seen how you manage the authentication process of Spotify. You have created an Xcode project that can work with the Spotify SDK, and you have also set up the developer environment of Spotify, and of course you have also this server running, which is pretty important. So always keep in mind that if your login process does not work, you have to run this server. So again, what you need to do is call Ruby Spotify token swap .rb, which will run this server and enable you to authenticate with the Spotify service. And of course, if you want to use this in a real application, then you would need to bring this token exchange server to a server that can be reached over the internet. So have fun with this Spotify SDK example, and let me know what you think about this SDK. And also if you want to see more tutorials using the Spotify service.